Okay, we're going to get started here. Welcome to API as a business enabler, from challenges to opportunities. I'm Abi Hosseini, your moderator today. And with me, I have a panel of distinguished speakers. Our focus today will be exploring challenges in succeeding with APIs. We have a great panel of participants and IT leaders today who will share their best practices and success stories with you. Allow me to introduce our panel first. I'm Abi Hosseini, Exavalu's Chief Digital Officer, and I'll be moderating today's session. I've been in financial services for about 32 years, capital markets, banking, and insurance, and 3 times CIO and CTO over the past 23 years, heading large-scale business transformations and digitizing different companies. With me today, I have Brian Schwinn, a transformation catalyst and founder of Digital Layer, and a visionary fellow CIO and Chief Digital Officer. Throughout his career, Brian has been on a mission to simplify and accelerate digital transformation for insurance companies and financial services companies. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in delivering successful API-first strategies to accelerate digital transformation. Brian has a really unique blend of business technology and executive acumen that translates technology issues and problems into measurable business value and transformational strategies to empower the companies that he has been at. We're also fortunate to have Nate Riddle, Regional Vice President for Financial Services at MuleSoft. Nate has been focused on working with diverse clients to help them succeed with API journey. He brings a unique perspective on how to succeed with MuleSoft as a technology, from acquiring the technology to succeeding with its operation and the governance aspects. MuleSoft has been dedicated to connecting the world's applications, data, and services together for many, many years and creating a product-led approach to composability and integration. And so we look forward to hearing from Nate about his suggestions and best practices on how to succeed with the technology. It's also great to have Naveen with us. Naveen Kurolta is our practice leader for MuleSoft at Exavalu. He brings a wealth of experience, over 24 years of leadership, leading complex enterprise application design and integration. He's really uniquely experienced in all aspects of delivering an API-first solution to MuleSoft customers and multiple industries. Once again, I want to welcome all of you participants to today's session. I look forward to an engaging and insightful hour of discussion and knowledge sharing with our participants. So as we kind of look at organizations who have been going down the path of integration and API-led transformation, each year there's about $500 billion spent on digital and data transformation. These services are really allowing the companies to rethink their front office, middle office, and back office operations. But also organizations are uniquely put under pressure to really focus on how to integrate their ecosystem partners and how to really play in the platform economy. So extending your enterprise to the rest of the partners and adjacent technologies and adjacent partners is a great challenge as well. So as we look at these challenges, we kind of like to group them into 3 major areas. One is your deliberate path, architecture, and approach to your deployment. Whether it's the specific licensing model or the solution that you put together from a scalability perspective for today and for tomorrow, there are definitely best practices that we can talk about in the deployment area. Secondly, once we are up and running and have built that architecture and roadmap, we want to talk about how to succeed with harnessing the technology, how to bring in operational capabilities and best practices, including visibility and management of such a platform. And then lastly, we want to focus on best practices around governing API as a service and making sure that we are truly leveraging and reusing the technology for success. So our speakers will talk about these three areas. I'm going to ask Naveen to step in with the first area, which is deployment and licensing model. And we will discuss things like over-provisioning and under-provisioning issues with unplanned licenses and architectural insights that would allow us to build it for the ability to scale the business as we go forward. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Naveen.
Sure. Thanks, Abby. I can talk about these challenges from my previous experience. I'll start with the over-provisioning and underutilized license. I worked with a few customers who had these challenges with over-provisioning and underutilized licenses. So one of the example I can share is one customer I had was over-provisioned resources, and they are not even utilizing 10% of the resources for each API. And customer had hundreds and hundreds of APIs in multiple environments. And again, one more example on underutilized licenses. Customer bought the license ahead of the actual prod deployment, but it took quite a long time to actually put the APIs in prod because this is the case. Sometimes you don't have chosen the right deployment model, and you don't have a strategic planning on how you are trying to use licenses. And about coming to the under provisioning, I had to work with the customer who always at 100% of the available resources. They're using 100% of the available resources in prod, no room to handle an extra load or not able to scale the resources. And again, the customer had to always get an approval at the last minute to buy those extra licenses because whenever there is a more workload come in, or they have to handle the more load, they have to go and scale these services and buy extra licenses. That's another scenario I have to deal with. But the most important thing to handle these challenges is customer should always look for a right deployment model. Whether it's full cloud, on-premise, hybrid infrastructure, or whether it's a combination or individually. You have to always assess your integration needs. If you're migrating your needs, you will know what you need. But if you're setting up the brand new infrastructure, there is always a challenge. But ensure proper sizing is done for both current needs and anticipated growth in the future, whether it's number of APIs going to build or the workload for each API. The sizing is very important so that you choose the right deployment model. And when you forecast these things, right, you never under provision the resources. Also, you have a proper strategy, capacity planning, and for the current and future needs, right? So you should always have the proper the strategy planning for even for the resources, whether it's whether you're buying the licenses. So that you don't have to, don't have to, wait for until you put it into production. So always try to look for latest, good technologies like containerization, load balancing, auto scaling, and so that these technologies can also support increasing workload, and make sure you have a proper high availability and as well as a DR strategy in place. And these are some of the solutions I always recommend for these challenges. But Nate, what do you think about?
Yeah, thanks, Naveen. Yeah, these are areas where working with our teams internally and your teams internally can be a huge advantage. The more we know, the more we can help in these areas. As an organization, we certainly don't want to over provision, meaning at the end of a contract, half of the licensing that you have acquired is being utilized. That's not a good place for us to be. Under provisioning is typically a challenge when it comes to innovation. If there are licenses that aren't able to be consumed or used outside of a project plan, then innovation tends to take a back seat. So there's definitely things that we can do collaboratively as a partnership to work with you all to make sure that you're not going to be over provisioned or under provisioned, and to make sure that you're getting the best price point that we can possibly give you. So that would be my suggestion on those top two. The underutilized and unplanned cost, you know, there are a lot of variables that go into contracts. Some can be 3-5-year contracts. And when you're trying to do estimations on what your project landscape is going to be 3-4 years out, it's impossible. And so strategic guessing and total cost of ownership are things that should be considered when you're getting into longer term contracts. From a deployment model, very important, particularly use case specific. So if you're doing batch processing, we would recommend that you would do batch processing not in our Cloud Hub environment. And the reason for that is we have single tenant environments in our Cloud Hub environment. And so what that means is you're going to be consuming, let's say, 1/10 of a core just to be able to spin up a batch process. Whereas if you were to put a core on-prem, which means either in your data center on an AWS server or Azure, you would be able to get, you know, 50 batch processes out of that one processor. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of going on-prem versus Cloud Hub. It's just please engage with your teams, and we will certainly provide you with the right architectural direction. But all great points, Naveen, and things that the more that we work together, the tighter we can be to that plus or minus 10% from an over or under provisioning, which would be better for everybody. Brian, did you have anything to add with your experience?
I think adding an actual kind of business scenario to that, that's great advice. In an insurance environment, we really needed to kind of step back, work with our business leaders and understand what we were actually API-ifying, if you will, and the loads that were going to take place so that we could better plan for provisioning and license costs. Things like month-end runs where we might want to allocate a full, you know, processor to a process that runs once a month rather than 1/10 of a core to something that's running all day, every day. And so it really just speaks to, while we all want to be agile and incremental in our software development practices, I think with respect to API enablement, you really have to have a plan so that you can better manage your roadmap around utilization and how to best leverage the platform, get the best cost effectiveness out of it.
Yeah, those are the good points, Nate and Brian. I agree with you. The important thing is you have to always assess your integration APIs, what kind of APIs you're going to build, right? So based on that, you have to choose an appropriate deployment model that is very important based on your APIs. And coming to that, Brian's point, you know, you always have to monitor your usage patterns regularly and make those allocations. Otherwise, you know, you just assign those resources, you forget, and, you know, you don't look at it. That's a very bad strategy. Always have a plan to look at that also. Yeah, I think that's all I have from my side, Abby. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naveen. So I think what we're talking about here mostly is, you know, being deliberate about your architecture, your roadmap, your business plan, and the ability to build things so that you can scale elastically as you move forward to other areas of the business. I have a question for Brian. How did you engage the business in trying to build these kinds of roadmaps? You know, how did you decide on entry points into the API world and the scaling that goes from there?
Great question. And it was really key to get that involvement, to get alignment across the enterprise and get the right inputs so that we could be successful, right? APIs are really about enabling business processes. And if you don't have a crisp understanding of what those business processes are, what the volume and speed required for them are, KPIs, et cetera, you're not going to be successful with this stuff. So we started very early. Like I said, it was insurance. And so we took an enterprise model, identified our key business processes that we wanted to either integrate or automate, and then started developing a program like a center of excellence where we would get business people and IT people in a room and talk about the use of these APIs and kind of how, you know, things like appetite, rating, issuance, quoting, these functionalities actually work, what volumes we were expecting, what products they would need to work with. and kind of gain that common understanding of what that API infrastructure looked like before we started coding. And so that helps drive kind of these decisions about deployment model and licensing size and so on.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. And then one question for Nate. As customers engage MuleSoft, how should they engage you in these kinds of discussions around capacity, architecture, and the longer term business intent?
Sure, that's a great question. So we have many different folks at our disposal that have key backgrounds in these areas, both senior architects, client architects, these types of folks that will really team up with our customers to really understand what that project landscape is going to be. And then if the project landscape is understood, then we can really get down into the weeds of systems of record that need to be included. What are the attributes that need to be included in an API call for a front-end portal or back-end processes? So we can really quickly start to determine what the capacity requirements are going to be based on volume of API call, payload, estimated payload, because that's usually a wide swath. And then we can really get pretty granular down to the API level on how much processing power a specific API is going to need in order to meet your SLAs. And we also take into consideration SLAs when we're doing our sizing. So if you've got a customer-facing application, it's a quoting application, something that's going to generate revenue, those SLAs are extremely tight compared to maybe some internal processes. Either way, it's going to be 500 milliseconds, half a second of delay at a max. The tighter ones can be 100 milliseconds or less. And so those all are factors that we need to take into consideration. If those things are unknown, then we can do some high level t-shirt sizing. But to Naveen's point, as he made earlier, the last thing that you want to do is over provision resources to an API. Let's say dedicating a bunch of processing power to an API that executes 10 times a day. That is a complete waste of resources, particularly how quickly and how efficient MuleSoft is. And so you want to be thoughtful on how you're allocating the resources that you have to specific APIs and how many times those are being executed on a second, hourly, daily basis. And we can help you with that. We have all kinds of tools and things to help our customers figure out what that's going to be. It's a great question.
Thank you, Nate. So we've talked about, being deliberate about our approach, our strategy, our roadmap, creating an entry point into, the architecture, if you will, but having an eye towards scalability and taking the service across the enterprise. Once we have layered all of this, now we need to think about operation. And operating an API first, the strategy and a highly complex integration architecture that not only weaves your applications together, but also weaves you and your partners together in ways that are mission critical from a business growth perspective, requires some deliberation around how to best operate these platforms, whether it's observability, monitoring, business activity reports, or the true resilience of the operation from the standpoint of being able to scale it. As you look at your historical data, as you look at the instrumentation, it really becomes important. So the practice of owning this technology and managing it in a way that can become a reliable service for the business is a challenge for many companies. And I'd like to hand it over to Naveen to talk a little bit about operations and engage the rest of our panelists on that topic.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I've seen customers having a different challenges related to operations, which involve all these areas like logging, alerting, resilience, historical data, as well as the monitoring. Sometimes I've seen too much logging is not good, and there is no adequate logging. That's another issue, challenge. Sometimes the customer had a specialized monitoring solutions, but there is no proper metrics, custom metrics or logs to support those tools. and they're not getting much out of that. So that is another problem area I've seen. And most of the time is no end-to-end visibility into the either flows or transactions of these connected systems. That's another challenge area, so that, operations cannot, don't get when they're, no visibility when they try to, look into the issues. And sometimes, too many alerts is also not good. So if you try to generate too many false positives, right, it can overwhelm the IT and operations team, and they don't know how to respond to that. And and again, it's always recommended to have a historical data for analysis or triaging in production, so that, similar issues may happen, or how to address that. And always, seen that, too much dependency on too many external monitoring tools, not utilizing endpoint monitoring effectively. That is another challenge area. So if you look at all these challenges, my take on this is, from the best practices perspective, adapt a, good best practices for logging, and always capture critical transaction details. Don't do too much logging, or, inadequate logging, or try to, keep it, capture all the critical transaction details. And always, whenever, if you're using any, specialized tools, external tools, make sure you enable your application to support those tools, so that you log custom data metrics or custom logs. Make sure you, either implement the end-to-end transaction visibility. That is an important area also. Otherwise, it's hard to get with an operations, or, when they start looking into things. And always try to, for the alerting, make sure you always create the rules. Don't just, keep on sending the alerts. Always recommend have a priority-based alerting, so that operations can always, respond based on a priority, so that, it can be addressed accordingly. And coming to historical data, it's good to have a retention policy for historical data, maybe 60, 90 day, 180 days, or maybe up to 1 year. Because if you have historical data, you may have encountered certain issues, so easy to resolve and quicker, and it can help you to go back and refer what happened, And coming to the monitoring, I always recommend to use endpoint monitoring. It gives such a good insight and visibility into applications, especially when you're trying to diagnose issues with the connector related issues, or if you wanted to see what is happening with the connectors, inside the flows. It provides much better visibility compared to other external tools, because I'm not trying to do here apples to apples comparison, but if you look at the monitoring, it provides quite a good details also. So Nate, what do you think on the operations from your point of view?
Yeah, the operation side is really key for longevity. The biggest value that you're going to get out of the platform is if your operations is being paid attention to and reiterated on over time. As you add on more development teams, as your organization grows, this is where you can really get the value out of your APIs and integrations from a reusability perspective. Checking in, checking out, those types of things are going to be critical. On the resilient side, regulated industries, of course, are going to be, a little bit more tighter when it comes to having I would say more standardized DR practices and resilience practices. What we've seen over time is that organizations really want to make sure that their critical APIs and critical processes are highly available and resilient. Some of the ones that are back office may not be that critical to have resilience on those. They may, but they may not. They may not fall under the regulatory nature. So being able to separate those out based on which ones are highly critical, which ones has sensitive data or passing sensitive data, all those sorts of things become an exercise where you can limit the amount of DR required because of the limitation on which ones would need to be highly available due to the regulatory pressure. On the historical data side, Naveen had a great point. One of the things that a lot of organizations are using the historical data for is to map out what their capacity requirements are going to be, or what they're going to need from a project by project basis. So if they've got a large project coming up and they know it's going to include a brand new SaaS-based application, and they're going to need to connect to 15, 16 systems of record, and they're going to need to orchestrate data and things of that nature between those. What is that going to look like from a capacity perspective? What we can do via the monitoring and historical data is go back and see, are there any processes that are working in our organization that have been running over the past year, and what has been the trend for those APIs, so we know how much capacity to dedicate to those APIs. So another way that historical data can be used. And then on the monitoring side, you know, our original focus was really around mean time to resolution. One of the things that our customers came to us and said, we still have the finger pointing going around. Our operations team is blaming infrastructure team because of database call that's coming from a Mule workflow, and everybody blames the MuleSoft API, and so we still have finger pointing. So how can we get tighter granularity on what actually is happening from an API being called to an API calling an external system or another API? And so that's kind of what we put in from a monitoring perspective. It's had a host of other, I would say, added benefits for our customers. That's just one major one. Naveen touched on the others. It's really to get that granularity. You can really understand how many times an API has been hit in any chunk of day that you want to see. So if you have high volumes in the morning and not so much in the afternoon, you know, you can really tighten those windows up to find out what's being utilized. The other thing is who's calling the API. Is it external sources? Is it all internal? You know, all of those types of things can be captured and then be able to be presented as historical data as well. So those are the three major ones that that I would want to talk about. Brian, you have anything to add to these four?
Well, I would echo what you said about the value of the platform and its ability to provide information about what's going on, and the value of that information to people beyond the scope of just IT. So in our insurance scenario, we, you know, it took a little bit of work to get around what level of logging did we want and what level of monitoring, and kind of weeding through the noise to get to the signal, right? And then once we did that, we were able to use that information, like you said, to tell our business folks, hey, here's who's using this and when they're using it, how often you're using it, whether it's successful or not, opportunities for optimization. It helped us extrapolate for future API development to understand what the load levels were going to be needed for provisioning. And so I would just say that it's not just an afterthought to monitor when there's errors in the platform. It's really an asset that can be used to better understand your business as your key business processes are flowing through this platform. And it's really instrumentation, right? I mean, at that level where you can really understand, optimize, correct, and do things like that, take advantage of that. The other thing I think that was really key in our implementation was we started with APIs. So we were doing a core system transformation, and rather than just buying a large core system, we started with our business processes and MuleSoft to build out these APIs that we knew were key to our business and that would be likely to have change. And so we're talking about forms, rating, product availability, issuance, and we API enabled those functions with componentized architecture. And in the whole process of developing and testing that, it was really important that we captured our payloads and enabled replayability, if you will, of a transaction. So when we were testing, or if we had an error, or if we wanted to, you know, rerun something, it was easy to take a segment of data of calls for the API and replay those through our platform. And so I think that's important for some businesses to be able to do that for a certain window of time. And obviously security comes into that too. So you really want to make sure you understand how that data is secured where it's being kept.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. That's all fantastic points. One thing I did forget to mention around the monitoring is one of the things that's been asked from us is, what is the value of MuleSoft that we've been getting over the past 2 years, 3 years? As we've changed our, let's say, how we go about going through the full software development lifecycle of an API all the way through run, how do we know what the value of MuleSoft is? And so what we've done in the monitoring solution is built out dashboards for C-levels, for anybody else that wants to see it, on what the value is. What is your reuse rate? And what does that mean from a cost savings perspective versus building, you know, those APIs or integrations over and over again, particularly if you've got disparate teams doing concurrent work. That's usually a big problem. And so those have been hugely successful for those who have adopted it. Just to be able to see and showcase and be able to look at a dash and see we've got, you know, 180 APIs. It took this long to build. Here's the run. Here's how many times they get called. Here's how many times they get reused in another workflow or another project. And that's something that you don't have to build again or spend developer hours doing. So it becomes a huge value add for the organization and the reason why we exist today.
Yeah, and I've found that's always of interest to our like our board of directors, or, you know, at a meeting, or the senior executive team is, you know, if you have good information on what value we're obtaining from the platform, it's always good to keep communicating that.
Yeah, those are the good points, Nate. Especially, I wanted to just mention the historical data and resilience, because I talked about only the API usage, but you should always have the data related to the resource utilization. That's very important. You regularly, you know, monitor that, and also have whatever the choose and deployment model you choose. Always, you know, make sure it supports your high availability, and you have a strategy for DR also. So that is all very important because it's both are interrelated. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, panel, for great insights around operations. I think we all come to realization that an API first or an API led strategy really requires an ongoing approach to managing that discipline and making sure that not only we're operationally resilient, but also we provide insights into where we need to throttle up or deprecate older APIs, or how to really harness the technology to enable the business. But once we have the operational issues, you know, kind of structured in a way that develops a path for success, we need to talk about governing this environment. You know, how do we make decisions about what APIs to build, or when to deprecate certain types of APIs? How do we make sure that we apply, you know, centers of excellence and, you know, best practices around how we apply software engineering practices to an API-led organization? And more importantly, how do we apply certain approaches from a governance perspective to succeed with change management, with collaboration between IT and business, whether it's the architecture team, the application development team, the NOC, and other aspects of you know, IT working with the business to create a 360-degree view of how the technology is delivering value and how it's being harnessed. So I'd like to talk a little bit about these governance issues, particularly with insights from Naveen as you've engaged customers, and with Brian as you've led these transformations. And then hopefully Nate can talk about what MuleSoft offers from a governance and a strategy perspective.
Yeah, sure, Abby. I can talk about what from my previous experience. So I've seen like multiple customers had different challenges related to the governance, especially. Customers I've seen is like, you know, they do not enforce, some customers do not enforce the governance, but they have the best practices and standards in place. So there is a risk of inconsistency across different teams or projects you call. So each team might interpret these best practices differently, and leading to the variations in the quality or the management of the APIs normally, because you don't have the team to take care of that best practices. And again, it can lead into inconsistent version strategy, inconsistency in managing or securing the APIs. That's very important part. So because some people may use some security policies and other team may be following that, they don't have a, you know, consistency in that as well. And you may, you know, I've seen that a lack of documentation. Some teams manage the good documentation and some teams lack the documentation. So there is a lot of inconsistency between the teams, and also managing the life cycle. I've seen there is an inconsistency. So if, basically, if there is no team managing an API catalog or API lifecycle, it could lead to, redundant APIs. It could lead to no reusability of APIs. People don't know that API exists already, and they start building the same APIs maybe, also the foundational assets. So my example from, best practice, when I say best practices standards, is make sure your design approach, your development approach, how you name your things, how you write your code. There should be always some best practices. And MuleSoft already provides a good best practice and standards. Otherwise, some organizations have their own internal best practices. But it's my recommendations is it's good to establish a C4E or a governance team. That is very important, and enforce all these rules, policies, and educate your teams in the organization how important being adhering to these governance policies, right? So, establish these best practices standards, either for you're talking about designing, coding, or versioning, how you want to secure your APIs. When I say secure, make sure, you follow standard policies, whether you're exposing an API externally or internally or within the 3-layer architecture. So always having these best practices is very critical. And also, the most important point of the C4ER governance, I would say, is when you have a new requirement or new use case to write an API, it has to be reviewed by the team. Otherwise, you don't know that the same reuse case is already provided by other APIs sitting out there. So, you need to get this reviewed, or somebody have to take a look at that, or you should take a look at the catalog, understand if the API already exists, you can reuse it, or if there are certain capabilities it cannot provide, maybe you can extend that API. And also make sure whenever, do the change management, right? When there is already the APIs providing services in production and you want to extend or add more features. So make sure whenever the changes happen, follow the proper versioning strategy and a life cycle stage. If you're releasing a new version, you wanted to deprecate the old version. So always, work with the governance and enforcing these rules around all the policies, rules is very important. Nate, what's your take on this governance? Yeah.
Yeah, so there are two sides of governance that I've been hearing most about in the market. The first side of it is what you just spoke about, Naveen, and I couldn't agree with you more. The best practices and standards that we provide, we have knowledge bases, we have articles where we can sit down and work with your organization based on your landscape and really come up with a strategy to define best practices and to make sure that they're implemented and followed in that Center for Enablement style hub and spoke model. The last thing that you want is for your Center for Enablement to be a bottleneck. You also don't want to have a defined integration team to be the bottleneck either, at least if you're a larger organization. We really kind of harness the power of reusability via a federated model, which is if you have 10 development teams, you want to have a Center for Enablement to make sure that those 10 development teams are following best practices that you've defined, but also doing their own development as an individual team based on their business unit or project load, those types of things. Much more work can be done in a concurrent fashion, and you don't want any specific individual or person become a bottleneck. As it relates to the versioning strategy, this is usually a very big one and where the monitoring can really come into play. If you're going to move from a version 1 to a version 1.1, you want to make sure that before you switch off 1.0 and push everybody to 1.1, nobody's using 1.0, and the monitoring can provide you that. The flip side of that is also true. You don't want 1.0 to be consuming capacity resources if nobody's hitting the API or there's no function to it. So you want to be able to remove that when reclaim those resources and provide that to an API or a new project load. So those are ways that you can kind of reconcile licensing or capacity if there are APIs that are going unused that are consuming resources today. The other side of governance, the API standards, the change management, there's two sides of change management as well. One, Naveen, the other one is people. When I speak to executives, that's probably their number 1 to number 2 challenge from a change management perspective, is making sure that the folks that are supposed to be using MuleSoft are using MuleSoft to drive what MuleSoft is intended to drive, which is speed, reusability, cost savings, hitting projects before instead of after you expect to be done with the project. So really getting that speed and efficiency out of it. And if some of the folks aren't trained properly, they don't know how to use the solution well, then they're going to fall back into old habits of custom code or using whatever they have been doing in their previous, previously, from usually custom code, but it can be something else. And so that's one of the biggest challenges at an executive level, particularly if you are an executive that has large groups of development teams. That can be a real problem. The other side of governance that I hear a lot about is really on the API, the governance and security side of API management. And that's where we've made tremendous strides at MuleSoft. So we've actually implemented governance into the tooling so that if it doesn't abide by the security standards that your SecOps team has put in place, then it gets flagged and it can't move from dev to UAT or UAT to prod. There's been a couple of effects that have happened. Number one, the SecOps team doesn't get bogged down with checking out APIs that don't conform to a standard where they're wasting time to just kick something back. And then if it does conform to the standard that the organization has put in place, then a quick check is all that's needed before you can start moving it on to the next, to either UAT or prod. And so from a UAT perspective, you're not spending or waiting 2-3 weeks for the SecOps team to review an API that you really need to go into production to hit a project timeline. That can all be done inherent to the tooling now. And so that's been a huge advantage on that side of the governance table. That is where I hear executives are challenged the most around making sure that the APIs that are either put into production from an internal and external perspective are following the governance guidelines that our organization has put in place by our SecOps team, and being able to understand which APIs don't follow those constraints. Audits are being failed, regulatory pressure is being ramped up, particularly on the banking side, but it's going to come to insurance and WAM sooner or later. It usually follows banking. So executives are trying to get ahead of this to make sure that best practices are being followed in this area as well. Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, I think all really good points. Thanks, Nate. I think it's really about a mentality to better understand kind of what you're doing with the platform and getting the business involved. I mean, most of the work in the MuleSoft platform would be either to integrate to, third-party data or third-party applications, or provide core business requirements, right? And so the tool's built in a way so that you can expose some of that in a friendly way to your business users and have conversations with them about the functionality. So when we talk about a team doing duplicate work, I think that shouldn't happen in an environment where business requirements are driving kind of the work, and you're communicating maybe on a monthly basis in a COE format around the tool to enable business users to understand what we've developed in this platform, what's automated, what's API enabled, those kind of things. So I think it's a cultural kind of mentality thing to adopt that best practices approach where everybody kind of knows what's going on and why. And that way you kind of avoid that redundancy or duplication. And then, as I said, the catalog and the tools within the platform are so powerful. I mean, as you mentioned, Nate, you can integrate standards and practices as policies within the platform and put those guardrails on your development team so that they're more focused on business logic and not rewriting a security routine or a other monitoring routine. All that stuff should be consistent and built into the platform as consistently as possible. So you really want to take advantage of those capabilities to be able to do so. I think, I recently came from an environment where we were a conglomerate. We had 15 different companies across 6 different industries that were performing a monthly accounting close and consolidation. And so, did we write, 6 or 16 different APIs for accounting close. No, we took the time to step back and have a mentality around how do we build this in a way that it works across multiple industries for multiple companies in a way where we can version something where one of those industries or companies has a change and it doesn't blow everybody up, right? And so the sooner you adopt that mentality of, it's almost like a software company mentality, right? You've got to maintain your product for existing customers, build new features in, and not, do any damage to the existing functionality. So I think that's a helpful approach.
Yeah,
For sure.
Agree with you, Brian. So its mentality is very important, because I've seen is developers mostly focused on only the development and they forget about the outer layer, all these best practices, security standards, change management. So that's very important, Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing that
Just a final comment on that. Simple way to approach that is when you're building something like I'll go back to insurance, a quoting application, and you're let's say you're building an API to deliver a quote onto a website or a mobile device. Ask yourself, what happens when we add a product, or we change this product, or we deliver this to a different channel? And try to incorporate that thought process in when you're building something, even if that requirement isn't there, because eventually it's going to come.
Yeah, from the cultural aspect of what Brian was saying, these things don't happen overnight. There is a long tail typically. So anything from brown bags and hackathons and things of that nature, just to get teams excited about the technology in a new direction, is something that we would recommend. And then on the other side, with the guardrails that Brian mentioned, hugely advantageous, particularly if you have large projects where you need external help in order to execute on a timeline. And now you're bringing in non-employees to come in and help from a development. They're forced to follow those standards as well, instead of going rogue. And now you've got to deal with, particularly after the project's over, deal with ungoverned or ungovernable integrations or APIs that were built outside of your four walls. So those are other advantages.
Yeah, thank you, panel. I think what I'm hearing is that, APIs are just like applications. They're a living thing. They come with some certain responsibility, ability to transparently share the capability across the organization and with your partners, your business partners. And more importantly, really think about coarse grain versus fine grain API development and the ability to really create this catalog of reusable capability. So as we kind of looked at deployment, we looked at operations, we looked at governance, I think we come to a realization that, there is obviously some implications for your architecture from a cost and licensing perspective, and opportunities to optimize or right-size your approach. We talked about, technical debt, deprecating older ways of doing things, being, all in with your API approach across the organization, and not allowing, future point-to-point kind of, capabilities that do not leverage API as a platform, as a service. We talked about frameworks like best practices frameworks and approaches that are prescribed by MuleSoft to really support a successful implementation and ownership of the technology. But it all goes back to, this is a living solution. It's a living capability. And we, as organizations and IT practitioners, we are at different stages of maturity with our use of these technologies, and there is a vast amount of opportunity to deliver to the business capabilities that really help them with acceleration of their digital transformation. So, getting your understanding of where you are in that spectrum, benchmarking yourself, looking at your current deployment models and your current architecture or your current operation and security approaches or governance becomes really important. I want to ask Naveen to talk a little bit about how do we benchmark ourselves? How do we baseline where we are and how we can create a roadmap for successful implementation of these strategies?
Yeah, sure. So adding to what Abby said, so if you are, currently experiencing any of the challenges we discussed today, right? So the path forward is here. So we can help you to assess your current platform and across different dimensions, definitely. So we have platform, logical, operations and security, API governance, DevOps. Our experts can definitely, assess your existing platform, provide, do an analysis and provide recommendations. And so we can reduce your technical debt, and also optimize your architecture, deployment model, and as well as the, utilization, license utilization. So, but we have a framework for that to do, how to achieve that. I wanted to introduce the framework actually, Abby. Yeah. So this is our integration framework. The aim of this assessment is to assess the customers in optimizing an integration strategy and maximizing the benefits. Basically, the assessment covers the thorough evaluation of different dimensions, platform, solution, API governance, and DevOps process, which I said earlier. So it addresses all the challenges which we discussed today. We talked about the deployment and license model. We're gonna cover that. We talked about governance, operation. So basically, we're gonna thoroughly evaluate that and provide a comprehensive analysis report and recommendations. It contains the integration your current integration capabilities by highlighting your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement. So that's how this framework can help you if you're having challenges. So we can come in and help you with this assessment and improve your platform.
Yeah, thank you, Naveen. I know we only have a few more minutes. There's a couple of questions that came in. We have about 6 minutes, folks, and I want to field some of this to the panel and see if we can address some of the questions that have come in. So one of them was, can you provide more details on core-based versus flow or message-based licensing model? When should we choose one versus the other?
Yeah, it's a great question. And then there's to be able to delineate between our SaaS environment and then an on-prem environment too, as it relates to core. So there's a couple of different options that we have. We came out with a new licensing model, and it went GA August 1st of this year. And it's usage-based. It's not consumption-based like AWS. It is usage-based. I know we're probably moving in that direction. Everybody asks us to do that. But it is usage-based. Instead of being tied to infrastructure-related details, cores and vCores and tenth of a core and processing and all that, basically what we're saying is you can spin up a single tenant environment, and we will, the charges or the way that the licensing will work will be based off how many times and what the payload is of the execution of those APIs or those workflows. Instead of having, which is a challenge that we talked about, if you're having 0.2 of a core dedicated to a batch process and only executes once a day, that's probably not the best design for you. In this model, you would basically be paying for the execution of that batch process instead of it sitting there idle for 23.5 hours a day. So that would be the biggest change in that model.
Yeah. Thank you, Nate. There was also discussion about Anypoint and its value from a governance and from a monitoring perspective. So the question is, do Anypoint monitoring solutions provide a better insight than the traditional enterprise monitoring tools that you put in your NOC? And also, how does Anypoint help with the governance aspects specifically? So maybe we can double up on those two questions and get some insights from the team here.
Yeah, sure. I would say it's different monitoring. You certainly couldn't replace your NOC monitoring with what MuleSoft monitoring does. It's very specific to the APIs that are running on our runtime, but it is much more granular than what any, I would say, enterprise monitoring solution would do. That doesn't mean that we can't talk to your enterprise monitoring solution and send alerts and send data to it. We certainly can. And so you can still have that NOC style response with our monitoring solution, but you're going to get much better granularity as it relates to challenges, or something kicks off an alert because of an SLA. an SLA issue. The mean time to resolution is really what you're after. Get rid of the finger pointing, get down to why, especially if it's a critical integration, quoting, revenue generating, those types of things are what we really want to focus on. On the governance side, I kind of hinted on it before, but it's really around making sure any API that I have, either I've internally facing or externally facing, is underneath the security standards that we've put in place as an organization. And if it's not, needs to be flagged and corrected. Audits are being failed because of this. You're unable to locate APIs, and some organizations think they have 150 and they have 700 APIs we've seen that they didn't know about. So this is a real challenge for executives to get their arms around, just so they don't fail audits from a regulated industry perspective. That's probably the biggest one.
Thank you, Nate. And Naveen, we talked about the integration assessment framework and how Exavalu can help create a baseline or benchmark. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what level of details or reports are generated from that assessment for clients?
Sure, yeah, certainly. So assessment report is of two types. We provide one is a summary and a detailed report. Summary report provides the observations and recommendations at high level, because this is provided as part of our quick integration assessment, which is 4 to 5 days. But there is also a detailed report which provides observations, analysis, recommendations at more detailed level. If I take an example, for example, if in an API-led architecture, we found redundant APIs or pass-through APIs, we will provide better recommendations so that you can realign these APIs in the 3-layer architecture and redesign them based on the best practices. And so basically the detail provide much more granular level details and more fine details. And because that detailed report requires assessment for 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naveen. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this really important topic. It's a great time of the year to think about, as you go into 2024, how you can really benchmark and baseline your current API-led strategies, and how you can throttle that up with some of the things that we talked about here regarding deployment model architecture, operations, as well as governance. We are available on LinkedIn. Post any questions, and I'm sure the panel will be more than happy to help any of the customers that are struggling with some of these aspects. And let's make it a great, successful year in 2024. Want to wish everyone happy holidays, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yep, thanks.